Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start this session now. Welcome back. My name is David Porteous. I'm from Integral Governance Solutions, and I'm very happy to be back in an iCoder event again. The last time I was with you was, first in Auckland, New Zealand in 2018, and then 2019 in Virginia Beach. But since then, I've taken a journey deeper into other areas of digital governance. And I'm very pleased this afternoon to have that journey reunite with the world of iCoder. So the session this afternoon of this panel is about linking together two big, broad, three-letter acronyms. And so the one is the one that you all know and love and which needs no introduction, ODR. But the second is one that does need some introduction because it's relatively new. And that's the word or the acronym DPI, standing for Digital Public Infrastructure. So I wonder, maybe just as a way of framing the conversation, I wonder how many people in this room have heard the term DPI before. If you have, maybe raise your hand. So I see one hand at the moment. Only one, and no more than one. Maybe not surprising, partly because the term is relatively new. It goes back about 3 or 4 years, but it's emerged strongly onto the global scene, primarily outside of the US. It's emerged through G20 forums. It's emerged through a global digital compact, which one of our panelists will be able to talk more about this afternoon. And it's on the lips of people, especially in countries today like India and Brazil. And so very quickly, just to frame our discussion for this afternoon, what we're talking about when we talk about DPI is about large-scale, reusable, foundational digital systems. So if you like today, so far we've been talking about AI as a general purpose technology and the way that changes everything. You could say DPI, this is about general purpose infrastructure. It's about reusable components of infrastructure for public value. And we're starting to see evidence of that changing things in other parts of the world. Just two very quick examples to give you a more tangible sense of what we're talking about. You may have heard of India's digital identity system called ODR. 1.4 billion Indians on the system with the digital capability which enables them to authenticate themselves, prove who they are with a thumbprint or just one identifying feature. Now, that doesn't sound like close to the reality we have here, and yet we're not that far away. Those of you who have social security numbers, a single anonymized unique identifier, that's what India has, but they also have the component of the ability to authenticate that securely online. So digital identity systems as one example. Payment systems. So in Brazil today, there's a payment system called Pix, which does instant transfers, account to account. It's only been live for about 5 years, operated by the central bank, and yet already its volume is such that, I guess we've been going in the panel 2 minutes. In those 2 minutes, there have probably been 1 million transactions in Brazil using this platform. The volume is approaching the volumes of the systems of Mastercard, and we have a speaker from Mastercard this afternoon already. Now, here's the issue. So the scale is already substantial when these systems start to gear up, but there's something else which gets substantial. So in the 2 minutes we've been on the panel, Pix has had 1 million transactions in Brazil. According to the central bank data, it also would have had 70 frauds and scams. So perpetrated against users of the systems who have lost money as a result of this large attack surface presented to fraudsters and scammers from around the world using digital public infrastructure. So we have this two-edged sword, as technology always is, enormous potential for enhancement of access for people to public services which are valuable and valued, and yet also increased potential for harm as well. And that's, of course, why this afternoon we want to explore the conversation about the relationship between ODR and DPI in two directions. So the first thing we want to explore, the first direction, is how DPI, these new large public systems, need ODR. Without it, they may be lost. That's called the call to opportunity for an audience like this here. But we also want to consider the reverse, which is the possibility that ODR needs a DPI approach, which means thinking about a modular, extensible, interoperable approach that creates a different way of handling disputes and, more broadly, digital justice, as Ethan and everyone else has been calling for a long time now. So those are the two elements of our conversation here this afternoon. I'm very happy to be joined by panelists who will help us explore that, although you've probably noticed that we have a gap on the panel. Unfortunately, Chitu Nagarajan, who's known to a number of you in this community, became ill on Monday as she was about to leave India. And so she, I believe, may be following online, in which case, Chitu, we hope you can hear us and see us. We're sorry you're not here, but we'll be able to contribute some of the insights she would have brought about how in India, DPI is changing ODR as well. But we want to start with the first leg of that argument. So let me introduce the first panelist alongside me here. Moritz Fromageot is from the United Nations Office of Digital and Emerging Technologies, part of the Secretary General's office, which is responsible for advocating technology and standards on a global scale. And Moritz, you've been at the thick of a number of these broader conversations, and particularly the conversation on DPI. So maybe you can start by giving the audience a sense of what you do there, and in particular how it touches on DPI and this need for ODR.
Thank you, David, and hello everyone. This is my first iCoder event, and it's very interesting to hear the great work that you all do. So many here might wonder, why is there someone from the UN participating in this conversation here? And David already pointed at DPI having entered the multilateral stage. And the inflection point there was the COVID-19 pandemic, when countries used, for example, payment systems to directly disperse cash to communities in need. And then through the Indian G20 presidency, it also entered a more geopolitical realm. I'm wondering, who here has heard of the Global Digital Compact? It's another three-letter acronym. Okay, so not so many. So 2 years ago, the UN member states adopted something called the Pact for the Future, which is a revitalized vision for multilateralism. And part of that is the so-called Global Digital Compact. And in the Global Digital Compact, the member states commit to increasing their investment into digital public infrastructure. But they also say that they want to develop and decide on a set of safeguards, because especially also in the UN system and many member states, they feel very strongly that how those systems are being built matters. Because unless you ensure that, for example, a digital identity program, which might be used to possibly fast-track financial inclusion, could also be used to accidentally or intentionally exclude vulnerable populations from receiving public services. Which is why at the multilateral level, we are developing, or we have developed, a policy framework called the DPI Safeguards Framework, which lays out 19 foundational and operational principles at the higher level. And then below that, practices and processes of how these principles can be upheld. And ODR would be one example of how such principles can be upheld. Let me just give you a few examples. So, for example, there is one principle that says that is do no harm. And grievance redressal mechanisms are a way to address any harm that may arise through, for example, digital public infrastructure, an identity system, for instance, or a payment system. Similarly, another principle that we have is the accountability and transparency, and in the same way also there, ODR upholds that principle. So how does this framework relate to the work that is happening here? As I said, ODR is an underlying practice for upholding the principles, and the value that I would say the UN, as part of this conversation and as part of this community, can bring to the table is linking the detailed work that you all do with the more abstract work, because you are the people who have the experience on how this unfolds on the ground and what an effective ODR mechanism looks like, and the member states have committed to scaling these mechanisms. But often the question is, how does this work in practice?
Thank you. Yeah, so it's clear that there seems to be, Moritz, this gap as these systems are scaling. It's not necessarily the case in many countries that access to grievance redressal is scaling proportionately. And that seems to be where, again, there's a need for a body of people such as those of you in this room to be thinking about scaling digital justice in some of its most profound forms. So we can build on that more. Let me go to the second panelist who's here this afternoon. Chris Harrell is Vice President at Mastercard. And Mastercard, as I think some of you may have a sense, is in fact the operator of one of the world's largest online dispute resolution systems already, but it's a private system. It's a proprietary system. However, out of the lessons of operating that, I think come a number of interesting observations which might be of benefit, Chris, for the world of DPI, of digital public infrastructure. So maybe you could give a sense for the audience about how Mastercard has, first of all, the scale of Mastercard's operation here, but also about what lessons have been taken out of that are relevant to this discussion.
Absolutely. And thank you, David. And like Moritz, this is my first time attending this event. And so thank you for allowing me to speak today. I think I have the easier path. How many people in the room have heard of Mastercard? Okay, fair. How many have one in their pocket? No, never mind. So for those of you who aren't familiar with exactly how our company works, we're a global payments network. We operate in over 200 countries, and our customers are financial institutions around the world, right? Our customers are not merchants and they're not consumers. The financial institutions issue cards to consumers on one end, and acquiring institutions, and I'm giving you this background so you understand because I'll be using these terms a bit. Acquiring institutions have relationships with merchants who want to accept Mastercard cards. That's called a four-party model, and Mastercard sits in the middle, enabling these transactions, processing these transactions, and doing it at a very, very large scale on a daily basis. Similar to the stats that David quoted for PIX, in 2007, we processed about 18.5 billion transactions a year. In 2025, we processed 175 billion transactions. The gross dollar volume that flowed through our system, meaning the value that those transactions represented in 2025, was $11.7 trillion. And so it's only 11 times what Elon Musk will be worth tomorrow, but it's still, we think, a lot of money. The goal, though, for Mastercard is to do that in a way that is convenient, easy, safe, secure, and most of all, trusted. Without trust, we absolutely cannot run our business as effectively. We won't scale. We'll ultimately fail if consumers and merchants lose their trust in our platform. And a huge piece of that is the ability to negotiate disputes. And so, as David pointed out, we have a very robust proprietary dispute resolution system that has grown up over the last 60 years to move from, when I joined the company in 2006, a very kind of manually driven process where banks were exchanging through us basically files, Excel files with disputes. And that had a lot of latency built in with it. It obviously had a lot of risk of inadequate data or data that wasn't standardized in a way that could be shared readily and easily and needed a lot of translation. And it required a lot of manual work, human beings to be involved, even in the most basic of cases, right? Ones that could be resolved. Over the last 10, 15 years, because the volume of transactions and the dollar amount has scaled so greatly, the dispute resolution system had to equally scale and had to come up to speed very quickly to be able to handle that. And as Moritz pointed out, the pandemic accelerated online transactions. We all know we went to buying, food online and having it delivered to our houses, those of us who could, and using other services in that way. And so that accelerated not only transaction volume, but the quantity of disputes actually coming onto our network that we had to process and deal with. And so I think in the past 10 years, the industry has really turned to focus on, yes, you must have a very robust dispute resolution system that has things like standardized data transfers, that's able to do case management well, live up to SLAs in terms of there are deadlines affiliated with different types of disputes. And so as a consumer, if you order something online and you don't believe that the goods you received were what was advertised to you, or let's say your card was compromised in some data breach and somebody started to use it to do fraudulent transactions, you of course want recourse with us and with your bank. And so we enabled an automated system that really drove most of the disputes through automated processes. So now, whereas we were operating at a very manual basis in 2007, 98% of the 70 million disputes we get a year go through pretty much automated steps with the intention of having them never have to reach kind of an edge case or where a human being needs to get involved to adjudicate. Now, I think one other key point that has to do with how we manage this at scale, and some of this David shared with me, I wasn't able to be here this morning, is about how you actually prevent issues from actually becoming disputes to begin with. And that's where the industry has put a lot of investment of late. We've turned our attention to how do you prevent the dispute from actually getting to a point where it becomes problematic for the consumer, harmful, funds are being withheld from different institutions and the parties to the transaction. And how do you basically never have it escalate to that point? And there are about, I would say, 4 or 5 mechanisms that I'll just reference quickly. I don't want to go into all of them. But it has to do with getting at the stem causes of disputes. And so Mastercard has spent a lot of investment, probably more investment in this area than any other, in combating fraud, right? So how are we basically detecting and preventing fraud on our system? By doing things like using AI to do fraud analytics in real time as a transaction's hitting our network, right? So understanding, is this transaction likely to be fraudulent, and therefore is a consumer likely to call foul, and are they likely to raise a dispute? We can identify that transaction, have it be declined, it never enters the system. We've prevented a down-the-line chargeback, most likely. Chargeback, for those of you who don't know, is how we refer to a dispute within the organization. I should have said that earlier. Second is authentication, strong authentication. Every one of us does this here on a daily basis. You use 2 factors, maybe 3, to authenticate yourself to a system. It's based on something you have, like a device, an application, and something you know, right? A password that's in your brain, hopefully, and not written down on a piece of paper on your desk. And you even might use a 3rd factor of authentication, like a biometric, like a thumbprint or a retina scan. And so strong authentication basically in the realm of dispute resolution is able to steer liability from one party to another. So if the issuer of your card, the financial institution, says, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that David transacted because I have his biometric information, I'm pretty confident I authenticated him and that transaction went on its way, the bank has fulfilled its responsibility for this sort of transit of the transaction until it hits the merchant acquiring bank, and they'll then do some analysis. And so authentication is a huge piece of this in terms of, has the legitimate person actually tried to purchase the thing they want, and can we understand that and add that to the data set that will be used in the event that it does reach a dispute. So that establishes a baseline set of data. The third piece is really around consumer clarity. And what I mean by that is, how many of us have gotten a statement at the end of the month and looked at our transactions or checked our app on our phone and said, AFD Industries 10:30 p.m. Friday night, and you think, well, I didn't think I purchased this, and maybe you've had a couple of glasses of wine, or and you might call your bank and say, I don't think I did this, and the bank is obligated to investigate, and they'll go off and do their due diligence. But more and more, because of good data sharing among the parties involved, you can look at your statement and see, oh, there's actually a real merchant name. I recognize that name. Or there's a merchant location. I recognize that location. Or they might even put the logo now on the statement. And so it allows for, instead of issues becoming disputes, they become inquiries, right? They become a conversation between a consumer and their bank to say, oh, yeah, I do recognize this. So you don't need to escalate it with the other party. Another place where there's been a lot of advancement in keeping issues from escalating is there's a lot of pre-dispute resolution tools out there. Mastercard's acquired some of these companies where it essentially allows systems using standardized data and protocols and rules to query one another and basically get information that allows them to sort of manage the dispute in an automated way through the data that's available, without ever having to register an official dispute in the system that escalates to the degree that you might have an edge case where a human actually needs to get involved. And then finally, the role of standards can't be understated, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about this, and I'm sure it's highly relevant for this. I've heard the word off and on all day. Tokenization, hopefully most of you are familiar with tokenization. It's the idea of having a randomized token that's encrypted represent a card account number. And so for a fraudster, or when that data is traveling in the clear through the system, if anybody were to pick it up, it would be useless. So it renders card data completely useless. So it does things like greatly diminish the incidence of fraud. And it's just a great example of how having a standard like that and have that be applied in systems where unique data and valuable data needs to be transferred from multiple parties for there to be a successful transaction. Like this fly is. For there to be a successful transaction, that stand-in data is so important, and it represents the power of standards. And so, I would just say, in closing, the way our system scales so well, and the reason it works so well, is because we've invested a lot of time in preventing issues from ever becoming disputes, but we've also invested a lot of time and money in standardizing the process, making it transparent, making it rules-driven. Mastercard is not only a payments network, but we're a global franchise, so all of our customers are licensed by us, and so that allows us the latitude to basically say, you play by the rules or you don't play in our system, and we have enforcement and compliance all around that. But it is really the reason our system is so trusted. It's the reason it's so capable, and it's the reason we've been able to scale so well, and seemingly as technology changes how we all transact and as new forms of value come into the network, we'll be able to hopefully scale with that, scale our ODR with it, and manage it all very well.
Thank you, Chris. So in many ways, what you've just heard here is the first leg of that connection that I was talking about, right? Which is about saying these new society scale platforms really do need online dispute resolution to deal with the type of issues that are presenting themselves, not least the kind of frauds and scams and things that MasterCard's been dealing with for a long time. And that's why the likes of the UN is taking such an active interest in promoting global guidance, global standards, even around that. And I guess MasterCard tells us that it's feasible to do that at large scale, although many of the governments going down this path are at an early stage of reaching out for what does that look like? How do they do that properly? I want to make sure before we come to you all for your questions, just to bring to the table the other side. In other words, how might ODR benefit from a DPI approach? And here, let me channel my inner Chitu, who's not here, as I said, but she was going to talk about an example that she is currently working on at the National University of Study and Research in Law in India. It's an ODR platform she's developing in the context of India, a country where, in many ways, the DPI platforms are the most developed. And so her point is to say that for someone developing an ODR platform, a national capability that ensures secure authentication. You know exactly who is claiming, and it's proven to a level of proof, and it's done almost instantly and almost free or free in a number of cases. That's a vast assistance to the ODR system. Every Indian citizen has access to a DigiLocker, a secure online vault where they can store verifiable credentials that can be presented as part of an evidence chain in a dispute case. Each Indian citizen has access to an e-signature that they can use to, for example, sign to attest a claim that they are making into a system. All of which means, says Chito, 0 paperwork and 5 minutes worth of onboarding into an ODR platform. And that platform still has to do all the things that you all know how to do, apply a rules engine, exercise all sorts of levels of escalation and judgment, the different levels we heard this morning from the National Center. All of that still needs to happen. But the fact that there's a DPI stack there makes that task vastly easier. And maybe it could go further, because I think what we heard in this morning's conversation was the beginnings of what could almost be framed as another layer in a digital stack, a national digital stack. There's an authentication layer called identity. There's a layer around data exchange of verifiable credentials that are accepted across a jurisdiction. There's a layer of payments for the settlement of claims, such as you've been hearing here. Could there also be a dispute resolution layer that standardizes the way those claims are treated? So we'd like to take your questions, but let me just, while you're thinking about that, just ask Moritz one step further, thinking on the standards question. This is obviously something the UN spends a lot of time thinking about. And this morning we had a conversation here about whether, in fact, international standards are achievable, right? And there was a strong argument to say, rather, don't waste time, I think someone said, waiting for the paint to dry, right? On international standards, rather pursue the professional standards inside what could become international standards. How do you see the likelihood or the prospect of getting international standards in this space?
So I think we are approaching the development of international standards when it comes to DPI from two different vantage points. So the way the United Nations looks at the conversation around DPI safeguards, for example, is very much from a normative perspective, because, for example, on digital identity, if you look into digital ID implementations across the world, they often fail. They are being held up in courts because citizens don't trust them, because they do not have the right, for example, data privacy mechanisms in place. They might not have grievance redressal mechanisms in place, and for the governments, this is an obstacle, not only and mostly because this hinders the adoptions of the solutions, and this ultimately means that they cannot reap the benefits of a digital identity, the benefits of a payment system, a data exchange layer, etc. So what we are doing is, on the one hand, trying to create a shared understanding on what safeguards need to be in place for DPI to be successful. And then on the other side, there's the question: how does this play out successfully in the field? So so we work with organizations like the World Bank, the UNDP, which does a lot of work on digital identity, for example. So like, once you have convinced a government that it is important to uphold certain rights of citizens as you build such a system, the question becomes, how does this look like in practice? How do you really build this? And I think this is where the professional standards and the standard setting organizations come in. And this is also where I'd like to encourage people here in this room to share their experiences and to actively participate in international fora and point out where a more abstract principle, like do no harm, have an ODR mechanism in place. How do you take it from there? How do you build this in practice? Because most of the times, at least for us in the UN Secretariat, we don't have that know-how, but we rely on partners that do have that knowledge. So I very much hope that there will be a development of a community around DPI safeguards and ODR, and that ultimately there could be a process where a standard on DPI safeguards could be developed.
Thank you, Moritz. So there's the invitation, but let's hear the questions. So I see a number of hands. Colin at the back.
Far be it from me to go in front of Larry, but I have the mic, so I'm gonna call on myself first, and then I'll go to Larry. I also want to channel Chitu, who is very sad that she could not be here, and I know this, David, you and she have been talking about this for 10, 15 years, and she is very passionate about ODR and DPI. And I think that the panel actually is great that we have a representative from the UN and a representative from Mastercard. I also want to channel another person who is sad they can't be here, Pablo, who is an NCTDR fellow, is a professor at Leicester. And Pablo and I have had a conversation, Pablo Cortes. We've had a conversation about, is the best place for ODR in the public sector or in the private sector? Now, I was at PayPal and eBay for many years. We had a great relationship with Mastercard. Thank you very much. Spent a lot of time interacting with the chargeback system. And I was always strongly on the private side. I didn't feel like any public entity could ever put together a dispute resolution system on the scale of what eBay built globally and for 250 million transactions all over the world, or 250 million users. Pablo was on the public side, and he said, look, it doesn't make sense for us to build justice systems for every payment network and every merchant. If we had Walmart court and we had JCPenney court and we had Target court, it's also fragmented, and there's no way that the merchants won't put their thumb on the scale. And many of the people in this room have worked in the trenches at the UN. We worked with UNCITRAL for many years, 6, 7 years, putting together the standards for cross-border ODR. And I'll tell you, it was like watching paint dry. But the good thing was it was a very deliberative process, and there was a lot of attempts to build that. When Mastercard makes a decision to change a chargeback system, you know, you can sort of issue an edict and things move fast. I mean, you can deploy things very quickly. And Pablo and I have had this friendly argument for a long time. And as of late, I find myself shifting in Pablo's direction. And when you guys talk about DPI, I am in the trenches as an entrepreneur trying to sell this to businesses, trying to sell this to sharing collaborative economy companies and saying, you need to build a system to resolve your disputes. And we have a lot of data that shows that this is a wise investment for those companies. But it does feel like when we achieve something, it's temporal. And when that person leaves the organization, maybe it falls off as a priority and then it goes away. But when we achieve it in the public sphere, it seems like it is permanent and it becomes part of the firmament. And I'm seeing this in India too. The Modi government is investing in the creation of a nationwide ODR mechanism. And once you start building on top of it, you can't remove it because it's in the foundation. So I'm curious to hear what I'm curious to hear what Larry has to say. But my question fundamentally, I'm putting this to you, the debate between me and Pablo. You're talking about digital public infrastructure, but can these systems operate at the scale and the pace that private entities can operate at? So please.
So Colin, let me just suggest one nuance before inviting my colleagues to comment on that, and while you pass the mic, which is when we talk about DPI, we need to distinguish centralization from standardization. So DPIs are not always about centralizing everything, but they are about standardizing on the basis that allows interoperability. And I think the question becomes, at an international, national, and even subnational level, what does standardization look like, and what thumb on the scale is necessary to tip into that for all the reasons that you suggest create the benefits of not having siloized systems which do not help trust. But I'm interested to hear, Chris, how would you respond to that?
I think I would pick up on David's point in that MasterCard, I think, has arrived at a point where DPI being an inevitable trend, that we have to understand how the public and private sector work together to basically create the best combination of capabilities within a DPI system. And so when David says it's about standardization, we firmly believe in that as progenitors of many standards throughout time, where we've gotten together with the other payment networks. And if you think about MasterCard working with Visa and American Express to come up with the chip standard, right, the chip that sits in your card, or the tokenization standard that I mentioned, that's a best practice, right? That actually achieves quite a bit. It gets at a lot of people around the world in terms of providing a capability that essentially allows you to walk into any place in the world and transact, whether it doesn't matter what card you're carrying or what type of account you might have. And so standardization is a way of addressing the fragmentation that exists in the world, and that DPI, I think, when developed at a national level, is perhaps not as far along as it needs to be and isn't moving as quickly, to your point. But it also goes a long way towards addressing what will be the need for more standards amidst more complexity, right? So if you think about AI and agentic commerce and what that looks like in a dispute resolution environment, or you think about people using the value of cryptocurrency, a blockchain, a central bank digital currency, or a stable coin, all this stuff is coming. And without standards and without sort of the ability to assemble that fragmentation back together of all the parties that are involved, it's very, very difficult. And so our concern is you need a lot of building in of the private sector capability as you think about a DPI approach. And it should be a very collaborative public-private type endeavor.
Moritz, I'm sure you want to add to that, but maybe we can take Larry's question and then have the opportunity to also, as we come back at the end, to respond.
I hope I'm not pushing you off track, but I'm hearing about DPI for the first time today, so thank you for educating me on the subject. But it does set my head spinning. We are spending a huge amount of time, I'm at MIT, looking at what continued change in AI means for cybersecurity. I teach cybersecurity. There's got to be a connection, right, between the evolution of DPI and the globalization of DPI and how we're going to deal with the effects of AI, and particularly in a post-quantum world, on cybersecurity. We don't have a way to trace the sources of cyber attack now. People don't want to report. Even if they report, they can't say what the cause is. FBI is supposed to report to them if you have attacked in the United States. They don't have any way, really effective way, of figuring out where the attack came from. There's got to be a connection. You could give me a hint about how does the emergence of DPI offer us new way of dealing with the impossible looking effects of AI on cybersecurity?
Either you like to respond to that, Moritz?
I'm afraid I'm not able to offer you a good response to that question. But it's actually a very valuable perspective because we usually look at how does AI change the way DPI functions. I never looked at it from the perspective of how can we address cybersecurity challenges through the DPI and AI nexus. Something that I will definitely take back. But I wanted to get back to the public-private conversation, and I think the pitch of DPI is that you reduce duplication, you create open systems, you as the government, you create an environment where all of the stakeholders can play on. By that, you reduce transaction costs and you make systems more inclusive. So I think it doesn't need to be that every company builds their own ODR system, but you do a thing in between, right? Where you provide the platform, and based on that, different entities can develop their own ODR applications that all follow the same rules. And by using that platform, they have to follow the same rules that were provided by the government, for instance, in that example, and avoid stakeholders putting their fingers on the scale.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to add anything to that before we take the next one?
Let's take the next one.
Okay. But maybe just to say on that, so certainly some of the standards, like the UN standards, do deal with the need for DPIs not to become single sources of failure in systems as the result of cyber attacks. I think your question about the reverse plays into how standardization on a cross-border level can help to deal with the source of threats. So the ability to share data on a standardized basis that's being trialed in open finance today across central banks. For example, the BIS is running a project called Project Aperta, which is testing out open finance on a cross-border basis across jurisdictions. That starts to close some of the attack vectors and windows. It doesn't deal with the whole problem, but I think it starts to create some avenues that open the conversation in that direction. I did see another question over there. Liz.
You are referring to DPIs as something that is national, and then Colin mentioned the company thing, and then he said the name that shall not be named. He said PayPal, and these people like ban people in Africa without explanation. They just close your account, they disable it. So when he said PayPal, I was like, oh my God, that is how it doesn't work. But when we think about this digital public infrastructure, there is an assumption that there is a government behind it, that there is a national authority behind it. And therefore, the next assumption is that it must be trusted. But we may or may not be aware that some or most of the governments are just nefarious and not necessarily for the best interest of the people. And in addition, there is because of this, there came the advent of the blockchain, which already has previously solved the issue of cross-border transactions. So why do we have the need to create an infrastructure that is public and that is managed by governments who generally are bad and bad at administering things that they are not aware of, if this is already working and there is a whole ecosystem already within it?
Yes. Liz, thank you. I'm very conscious of our time here, Colin. We have just a few minutes left. Is it worth taking one more question and then we can respond to Liz's question? Any others?
I think that's a good approach. Does anybody have a question they'd like to pose to the panel? All right, let's go with Liz's.
Let's pick up on the question of, so why should we bother if there are decentralized alternatives like blockchain out there presenting alternatives? Why rely on any form of public authority structure? Either of you like to start that?
Okay, I can take a stab at this. So the DPI stack, we think of three foundational layers: digital identity at the foundation, digital payments above that, and then data exchange. So these are what we refer to as the foundational layers. And when you say there are already existing private ecosystems, that might apply for the payments ecosystem. But what you don't want is the private sector, for example, to start issuing identities, right? Or taking over that part of a sovereign government. So I think like there's the difference between the different layers of the DPI stack. And what you said about not trusting government, this is where the DPI safeguards principles come in and why they are so important. So, for example, when you build a digital identity system, what we promote is we say, okay, it should be embedded in a multi-stakeholder holding environment where it is not just the government setting the rules, but where you have civil society participating, where you, for example, make sure that the government does not, as part of their digital identity program, collect 100 data points, but really minimizes the data that they're collecting on the, I don't know, maybe the top 5 most important data points. And those are aspects that are surfaced when you work together with the multi-stakeholder ecosystem and not just rely on government making those decisions.
Thank you. Chris, would you like to add anything? Any closing thoughts in addition to Liz's question?
I would just add that, it's obvious there are pros and cons to both of these approaches, and I don't think they're binary in terms of being completely divergent. I think you want to be able to include capabilities that the private sector is really very good at delivering in how you think about and architect a DPI type system. And whether that's an application layer that sits on basic foundational infrastructure elements, or something more robust, or is delivered as a service by a provider like Mastercard, I think that ultimately is going to deliver better long-term outcomes. I think to your earlier point about fraud and sort of understanding what's happening in the fraud space, especially in an AI-driven environment, digital sovereignty is on the rise among nations. The likelihood that nations are going to be sharing data around fraud vectors and understanding what's happening in one country or another, and having the mechanisms and the standardization to be able to share that data effectively, Mastercard as a company, and this isn't a promotion for us, but because we have a global footprint, we can look across our network and understand what's happened from a fraud perspective globally and instantly, right? We can see trends emerging in one country and how those might be emerging in the same kind of manifestation in another country. And so we have that ability, and that's not something that is, massively competitively differentiating for us, because we work directly with governments to share that kind of information. And it's even we with a global view find that challenging. And so if you then have to say there are national systems talking to national systems talking to national systems, that complexity grows very quickly. And so it's a long-winded way of saying I think there's best practices both from the private sector and in a DPI context that if they're not shared and where the cream doesn't rise to the top, then I think both systems ultimately will suffer in the long term.
Thank you. So as we wrap up this afternoon, I hope you've heard that DPI isn't only or mainly about an environment of trusting governments, because that doesn't apply in many, many countries around the world. It is about how do you create healthy digital ecosystems with an anchoring point. And that's where the role of standards really matters. That's where the role of open source technology can help. It's where even decentralized technologies have their role to play as well. So I hope from this panel this afternoon you've learned a bit about DPI. For those who haven't heard about it before, I hope you've heard the opportunity which exists for this community to engage. You've heard the UN open the door to discourse around that, inspired by the examples of the likes of Mastercard, dare we say PayPal and eBay and everyone else who's shown this can be done better, and it can be done transformationally, as we've been hearing throughout today. So thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Colin, for the opportunity.